Before Shaq became a global icon with championships, fame, and millions of fans, he was just a struggling kid with oversized feet and a dream that almost disappeared. But one forgotten coach named Michael Bennett saw greatness in him when nobody else did. And decades later, Shaq returned to Newark to find the man who quietly protected his dream, proving that the greatest impact in life is not always made by those who stand in the spotlight, but by those who believe in us before we even believe in ourselves. On a cold morning in Newark, New Jersey, a black SUV moved slowly through streets that carried decades of memories. Inside the car sat a man the whole world knew as Shaq. To millions of people, Shaq was a legend. He was a four-time NBA champion, a Hall of Famer, a businessman, an entertainer, and one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet. He had achieved things most people only dream about. He had the money, the success, the fame, and the respect that came with a lifetime of hard work. But that morning, none of those things mattered. The championship rings were not the reason he came back. The cameras were not the reason. The headlines were not the reason. He was not returning to Newark as a basketball superstar. He was returning as a kid who never forgot the person who believed in him. Because before the millions of fans, before the bright lights, before the packed arenas and the trophies, there was just a 14-year-old boy who was unsure of himself. A tall, awkward kid with huge feet who was still trying to figure out where he belonged. And there was one man who looked at that boy and saw something nobody else could see. A man named Coach Michael Bennett. For most of the world, Coach Bennett was just another forgotten coach from a small neighborhood gym. He never became famous. He never stood on a championship stage. His name never appeared on television screens. But to Shaq, he was the first person who looked at him and said, "You can become something." That belief stayed with Shaq for his entire life. Years passed. The little boy from Newark became one of the greatest basketball players in history. But no matter how far he traveled, no matter how many awards he received, there was always one unfinished chapter in his story. He never got the chance to truly thank the man who helped him begin. And now, after all those years, he was finally coming home. The idea started with a simple question from his producer, Emily Carter. "Shaq, when you think about everything you have achieved, who helped you become the person you are today?" It was not a question about basketball. It was not about coaches who trained him after he became famous. It was about the people who were there before anyone was watching. Shaq did not need time to answer. One name immediately came to his mind: Coach Michael Bennett, the man who saw potential in him when all Shaq saw was failure, the man who stayed after practice when everyone else went home, the man who taught a young boy that making mistakes did not mean he was not good enough. That conversation changed everything, because Shaq realized something important. There were many people who celebrated him after he became successful, but very few people believed in him before he had anything to show, and Coach Bennett was one of those people. "This isn't about basketball," Shaq told Emily quietly. She looked at him, waiting for him to explain. "I have spent my whole life chasing success," he said, "but there is one person who deserves to know he was part of it." Those words carried more weight than any championship trophy, because Shaq was not going back to Newark to show Coach Bennett what he had become. He was going back to show him that his belief mattered. He wanted that old coach to know that every late night in the gym, every correction, every encouraging word, and every moment when he refused to give up had not disappeared. Someone remembered. Someone carried those lessons for decades. As the car continued through Newark, Shaq looked out the window quietly. The streets had changed. Some buildings were different. Some places were gone. But the feeling was still there. This was where everything started. Before the fame, before the money, before the world knew his name. There was only a kid with a basketball, a dream he barely understood, and a coach who believed in him before he believed in himself. And after nearly 4 decades, Shaq was finally going back to find that man. After Shaq made the decision to return to Newark, There was one thing standing between him and the person he had spent decades wanting to thank. They had to find Coach Michael Bennett. At first, everyone thought it would be simple. After all, Coach Bennett had played an important role in the childhood of one of the most famous athletes in the world. Surely there would be records, interviews, articles, or some kind of information showing where he was and what he had been doing all these years. But the deeper Emily Carter looked, the more she realized something surprising. Coach Bennett had almost disappeared, not because he had done anything wrong, not because people did not appreciate him, but because he had spent his entire life helping others without ever trying to make himself known. In a world where almost everyone leaves behind a digital footprint, Coach Bennett had almost none. There were no social media accounts with his name. There were no recent interviews. There were no videos of him talking about his connection to Shaq. There were no articles celebrating the coach who helped shape one of the greatest basketball players of all time. It was almost as if history had forgotten him. But Emily quickly discovered something important. The internet had forgotten Coach Bennett. People had not. She started searching through old community records from Newark. She contacted youth basketball programs from decades earlier. She looked through newspaper archives, old church documents, and neighborhood organizations that might have kept information about the people who served the community. Every search led her deeper into the past. She found small pieces of a story that had never been told. A former community worker remembered a coach who stayed late at the gym because some kids had nowhere else to go. A former player remembered a coach who cared less about winning games and more about making sure every child believed they mattered. The more Emily learned, the more she understood why Shaq wanted to find him. Coach Bennett was not just a basketball coach. He was the kind of person who quietly changed lives and walked away without asking anyone to remember his name. But finding him was still difficult. Days turned into weeks. Emily searched every possible place she could think of. She contacted old basketball programs, checked community archives, and followed every small clue that might lead her closer to him. Several times she thought she had found the right person, but each time the trail ended. It began to feel like Coach Bennett had become a memory that only existed in the hearts of the people he helped. Then, after weeks of searching, Emily received a phone number from someone who knew his name, a woman named Grace Miller. Grace had lived in Newark for many years. She knew the neighborhoods, the families, and the people who had quietly shaped the community. When Emily introduced herself and explained why she was calling, Grace became silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, a meaningful silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone suddenly realizes an old chapter of their life is being opened again. "Did you say Shaq?" Grace finally asked. Emily smiled. "Yes, he is trying to find Coach Michael Bennett." For a moment, Grace said nothing. Then she quietly replied, "I never thought I would hear that name connected to him again." Emily leaned closer to the phone. "You know Coach Bennett?" Grace took a deep breath. "I knew him before the world knew Shaq." Those words immediately caught Emily's attention, because that was exactly what this story was about. Before the championships, before the fame, before millions of people knew his name, there was a small gym in Newark and a coach who believed in a young boy who did not yet believe in himself. Grace told Emily that Coach Bennett was still alive. He had never left Newark. He was still living in the same community where he had spent most of his life. But then her voice changed. She explained that things were different now. Years earlier, Coach Bennett had suffered a stroke. He survived, but it changed many things. His memory became fragile. Some days he remembered details from decades ago with incredible clarity. Other days, simple things became difficult. Some names stayed with him. Some names disappeared. Some moments remained sharp. Others became covered by a fog he could not always escape. Emily listened carefully because she understood what this meant. Finding Coach Bennett was no longer just about bringing two people together. There was now a question nobody wanted to ask. Would he remember Shaq? Would the man who had believed in him before anyone else recognize the person he had become? When Emily called Shaq and shared what she learned, she expected him to focus on himself. She expected him to ask the obvious question, "Does he remember me?" But that was not the first thing Shaq asked. "Is he okay?" That was his only concern, not his own feelings, not the possibility of disappointment, just the man who had once helped him. Emily explained that Coach Bennett was safe, but his memory was not what it used to be. There was a quiet moment on the phone. Shaq said nothing for several seconds, because suddenly the person he had spent so many years trying to thank was no longer just a memory from his childhood. He was an elderly man who had lived a quiet life and carried his own struggles. And for the first time, Shaq felt something he rarely experienced. Fear. Not fear of losing a game. Not fear of pressure. Not fear of standing in front of thousands of people. This was different. This was the fear of walking up to the person who changed your life and wondering if they would even know who you were. An old volunteer remembered a man who bought basketball shoes for children who could not afford them, but never wanted anyone to know. The world knew Shaq. Fans knew Shaq. Millions of people knew his name. But what if the man who mattered most no longer remembered it? Emily carefully asked him the question that was on both of their minds. What if he doesn't remember you? Shaq stayed quiet. Then he answered softly. If he forgets my name, that's okay. His voice was calm, but there was emotion behind every word. I didn't come here to be remembered. I came here to say thank you. That sentence explained exactly why Shaq was returning to Newark. He was not looking for a perfect reunion. He was not looking for a moment that would go viral. He was not looking for Coach Bennett to tell the world that he helped create a legend. He only wanted one thing. He wanted the man who believed in him when he was just a struggling kid to know that his kindness mattered. Every late night in the gym mattered. Every correction mattered. Every encouraging word mattered. Every time Coach Bennett told him to keep trying mattered, because sometimes the people who change our lives never realize how far their influence travels. A few words from one person can stay inside another person for decades, and Shaq had carried those words his entire life. Now, after all these years, he was finally going back to the place where those words began. The search was over. Emily had an address, a small house in Newark, a quiet street, a man who had been forgotten by the world, but never forgotten by Shaq. And soon, Shaq would stand in front of that door and discover whether the coach who changed his life still remembered the little boy he once believed in. After Shaq made the decision to return to Newark, there was one thing standing between him and the person he had spent decades wanting to thank. They had to find Coach Michael Bennett. At first, everyone thought it would be simple. After all, Coach Bennett had played an important role in the childhood of one of the most famous athletes in the world. Surely there would be records, interviews, articles, or some kind of information showing where he was and what he had been doing all these years. But the deeper Emily Carter looked, the more she realized something surprising. Coach Bennett had almost disappeared, not because he had done anything wrong, not because people did not appreciate him, but because he had spent his entire life helping others without ever trying to make himself known. In a world where almost everyone leaves behind a digital footprint, Coach Bennett had almost none. There were no social media accounts with his name. There were no recent interviews. There were no videos of him talking about his connection to Shaq. There were no articles celebrating the coach who helped shape one of the greatest basketball players of all time. It was almost as if history had forgotten him. But Emily quickly discovered something important. The internet had forgotten Coach Bennett. People had not. She started searching through old community records from Newark. She contacted youth basketball programs from decades earlier. She looked through newspaper archives, old church documents, and neighborhood organizations that might have kept information about the people who served the community. Every search led her deeper into the past. She found small pieces of a story that had never been told. A former community worker remembered a coach who stayed late at the gym because some kids had nowhere else to go. An old volunteer remembered a man who bought basketball shoes for children who could not afford them but never wanted anyone to know. A former player remembered a coach who cared less about winning games and more about making sure every child believed they mattered. The more Emily learned, the more she understood why Shaq wanted to find him. Coach Bennett was not just a basketball coach. He was the kind of person who quietly changed lives and walked away without asking anyone to remember his name. But finding him was still difficult. Days turned into weeks. Emily searched every possible place she could think of. She contacted old basketball programs, checked community archives, and followed every small clue that might lead her closer to him. Several times, she thought she had found the right person. But each time, the trail ended. It began to feel like Coach Bennett had become a memory that only existed in the hearts of the people he helped. Then, after weeks of searching, Emily received a phone number from someone who knew his name, a woman named Grace Miller. Grace had lived in Newark for many years. She knew the neighborhoods, the families, and the people who had quietly shaped the community. When Emily introduced herself and explained why she was calling, Grace became silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, a meaningful silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone suddenly realizes an old chapter of their life is being opened again. "Did you say Shaq?" Grace finally asked. Emily smiled. "Yes, he is trying to find Coach Michael Bennett." For a moment, Grace said nothing. Then she quietly replied, "I never thought I would hear that name connected to him again." Emily leaned closer to the phone. "You know Coach Bennett?" Grace took a deep breath. "I knew him before the world knew Shaq." Those words immediately caught Emily's attention, because that was exactly what this story was about. Before the championships, before the fame, before millions of people knew his name, there was a small gym in Newark, and a coach who believed in a young boy who did not yet believe in himself. Grace told Emily that Coach Bennett was still alive. He had never left Newark. He was still living in the same community, where he had spent most of his life. But then her voice changed. She explained that things were different now. Years earlier, Coach Bennett had suffered a stroke. He survived, but it changed many things. His memory became fragile. Some days he remembered details from decades ago with incredible clarity. Other days, simple things became difficult. Some names stayed with him. Some names disappeared. Some moments remained sharp. Others became covered by a fog he could not always escape. Emily listened carefully because she understood what this meant. Finding Coach Bennett was no longer just about bringing two people together. There was now a question nobody wanted to ask. Would he remember Shaq? Would the man who had believed in him before anyone else recognize the person he had become? When Emily called Shaq and shared what she learned, she expected him to focus on himself. She expected him to ask the obvious question, "Does he remember me?" But that was not the first thing Shaq asked. "Is he okay?" That was his only concern, not his own feelings, not the possibility of disappointment, just the man who had once helped him. Emily explained that Coach Bennett was safe, but his memory was not what it used to be. There was a quiet moment on the phone. Shaq said nothing for several seconds, because suddenly, the person he had spent so many years trying to thank was no longer just a memory from his childhood. He was an elderly man who had lived a quiet life and carried his own struggles. And for the first time, Shaq felt something he rarely experienced. Fear. Not fear of losing a game, not fear of pressure, not fear of standing in front of thousands of people. This was different. This was the fear of walking up to the person who changed your life and wondering if they would even know who you were. The world knew Shaq. Fans knew Shaq. Millions of people knew his name. But what if the man who mattered most no longer remembered it? Emily carefully asked him the question that was on both of their minds. What if he doesn't remember you? Shaq stayed quiet. Then he answered softly, "If he forgets my name, that's okay." His voice was calm, but there was emotion behind every word. "I didn't come here to be remembered. I came here to say thank you." That sentence explained exactly why Shaq was returning to Newark. He was not looking for a perfect reunion. He was not looking for a moment that would go viral. He was not looking for Coach Bennett to tell the world that he helped create a legend. He only wanted one thing. He wanted the man who believed in him when he was just a struggling kid to know that his kindness mattered. Every late night in the gym mattered. Every correction mattered. Every encouraging word mattered. Every time Coach Bennett told him to keep trying mattered. Because sometimes the people who change our lives never realize how far their influence travels. A few words from one person can stay inside another person for decades. And Shaq had carried those words his entire life. Now, after all these years, he was finally going back to the place where those words began. The search was over. Emily had an address, a small house in Newark, a quiet street, a man who had been forgotten by the world, but never forgotten by Shaq. And soon, Shaq would stand in front of that door and discover whether the coach who changed his life still remembered the little boy he once believed in. After weeks of searching, Shaq finally had the address, a small house in Newark, a quiet street, a place where the man who had changed his life had spent decades living away from the spotlight. The drive there was shorter than Shaq expected, but emotionally it felt much longer. As the SUV moved through the streets of Newark, Shaq looked out the window and saw pieces of his past everywhere. The neighborhoods had changed. Some buildings were different. Some places he remembered were gone. But the feeling of coming home was still there. This was where everything started. Before the championships. Before the millions of fans. Before the world knew his name. This was where a young boy with oversized shoes and an uncertain future first met the person who made him believe he could become something more. When the car finally stopped in front of the house, Shaq stayed inside for a moment. He did not rush out. He just sat there quietly, looking at the place in front of him. It was not the kind of house anyone would notice while driving by. The blue paint on the outside had faded after years of weather. The small garden in front looked like it had once been carefully cared for, but time had slowly taken its toll. A few plants were still growing, holding on despite years of neglect. The front steps showed their age. One step had a long crack running through it. To most people, it was just an old house, but to Shaq it was something much bigger. This was the place where the man who believed in him had lived all these years. This was where Coach Michael Bennett had watched his journey from a distance. This was where all those memories had been kept. Shaq stepped out of the car and slowly walked toward the front door. With every step, the confidence of the superstar disappeared, and the emotions of the young boy came back. It was strange. Shaq had stood in front of thousands of fans. He had played in the loudest arenas in the world. He had handled pressure that most people could never imagine. But standing in front of this small blue house, he felt something completely different. He felt nervous. Because this was not about basketball. This was not about proving himself. This was about facing the person who helped him become the man he was. And deep inside, there was one thought he could not ignore. What if Coach Bennett did not remember him? What if the man who had spent years believing in him looked at him and saw only a stranger? For a moment, Shaq stood on the porch and looked at the door. The world saw him as someone who could overcome anything. But in that moment, he was simply a man hoping the person who mattered most would still know him. Emily watched from a short distance away and understood that this moment belonged only to him. There were no cameras, no interviews, no audience. Just Shaq, an old house, and a memory that had waited almost 4 decades. He raised his hand and knocked. The sound was quiet. Then nothing happened. Shaq waited. The street was silent. He looked at the door, almost expecting it to open immediately. But it did not. He knocked again. Still nothing. A few seconds passed. For the first time, doubt entered his mind. Maybe Coach Bennett was sleeping. Maybe he was not home. Maybe this was not the right moment. Then Shaq took a breath and knocked one more time. The third knock was different. It was not louder. It was not stronger. but somehow it carried all the years between them. Inside the house, there was movement, a small sound, a slow step. Someone was walking toward the door. Shaq stood completely still. The man who had faced the biggest moments in sports history waited quietly on a small porch in Newark. And behind that door was the person who had believed in him before anyone else ever did. The door slowly opened, and for a few seconds, neither man said anything. Shaq stood on the porch, looking down at the person who had shaped the beginning of his journey. But the man standing in front of him was not the same coach Shaq remembered from his childhood. The strong, energetic man who used to walk across the gym floor with a basketball under his arm was gone. The years had changed him. His hair was now white. His shoulders were smaller. His movements were slower and more careful, like every step required a little more thought than it used to. But there was one thing that had not changed: his eyes. Those eyes were still the same. They still carried the same calm confidence that Shaq remembered from the old gym in Newark. The same eyes that once watched a young boy miss shot after shot but never gave up. The same eyes that looked past mistakes, past awkward movements, and past the things everyone else noticed. Those eyes had always seen something more. They had seen a future that Shaq himself could not imagine yet. For a moment, Shaq wanted to say everything at once. He wanted to tell Coach Bennett about the championships, about the years in the NBA, about the thousands of fans who cheered his name, about all the things that happened after that small gym in Newark. But when he looked at the elderly man standing in front of him, he realized none of that was important. Not yet. This moment was not about what Shaq had become. It was about the person who helped him begin. "Coach Bennett," Shaq finally said, his voice softer than usual. "It's me." The old coach looked up at him. He studied his face carefully. For several seconds, there was no reaction. Shaq felt his heart sink slightly. This was the moment he had imagined for so long. But maybe the years had taken too much. Maybe the stroke had taken away the memories he wanted to bring back. Maybe the man who changed his life would not know him anymore. And strangely, that hurt more than any loss Shaq had ever experienced on a basketball court. Because losing a game was temporary. But the thought of becoming a stranger to someone who meant everything to you was different. Coach Bennett looked at him quietly. His eyes moved across Shaq's face, then his shoulders, then his hands, searching, trying to find something familiar. Shaq stood there patiently, giving him time. He did not want to force a memory. He did not want Coach Bennett to feel embarrassed if he could not remember. After all, Shaq did not come back expecting anything. He came back to give something: gratitude. Then suddenly, Coach Bennett's eyes moved downward, past Shaq's enormous shoulders, past his chest, all the way down to his shoes, those famous size 22 feet, the same feet that had made him stand out as a child, the same feet that made other kids laugh when he first walked into the gym, the same feet that Coach Bennett noticed before anyone else understood what they meant. Something changed on Coach Bennett's face. It was small at first, a slight movement, a spark of recognition, like an old light turning back on after years in the dark. He looked back up at Shaq, and then he smiled. Not the smile someone gives when they recognize a celebrity. Not the smile someone gives because they are standing next to a famous person. It was the smile of someone seeing a memory come back to life. "Those feet," Coach Bennett whispered. His voice was quiet and shaky. Shaq stopped breathing for a moment, because he knew those words. He had heard thousands of people talk about his size. They talked about his height, his strength, his dominance, his ability on the court. But nobody talked about his feet the way Coach Bennett did. Because Coach Bennett was not seeing the NBA superstar. He was seeing the kid who was too tall, too awkward, and still trying to understand his own potential. Coach Bennett looked at him and continued softly. "Those feet, I knew they were going to take you somewhere." And in that moment, Shaq felt something break inside him. Not because the words were dramatic, not because they were loud, but because they proved something he had been hoping for all along. Coach Bennett remembered. Maybe he did not remember every championship. Maybe he did not remember every team Shaq played for. Maybe he did not remember the millions of people who knew his name. But he remembered the most important part. The beginning. The boy. Shaq lowered his head and smiled through the emotion building inside him. "Yes, Coach," he whispered. "It's me." For a moment, neither man moved. Then Shaq stepped forward and wrapped his arms around him. The size difference between them was almost impossible to describe. One man had become a giant in the eyes of the world. The other man had become smaller with age. But in that embrace, none of that mattered. Because at that moment, Shaq was not a superstar. He was not a champion. He was just a kid who finally came back to thank the person who believed in him first. Coach Bennett placed his hands on Shaq's back, slowly, carefully, like he was making sure this moment was real. And as they stood together on that old porch in Newark, Shaq understood something powerful. The world remembered him because of what he achieved, but Coach Bennett remembered him because of who he was before he achieved anything. And sometimes, the people who know us before the success are the ones who know us best. Because they do not see the trophies, they see the person holding them. And after all these years, the coach who once believed in a struggling 14-year-old boy was standing in front of him again. Not because he remembered the legend, because he remembered the child. Before Shaq became the player that millions of people around the world admired, before the championships, before the fame, before people knew him as one of the most dominant athletes in basketball history, he was just a 14-year-old kid trying to find his place. And the truth was, he was not very good at basketball yet. When Shaq first walked into Coach Michael Bennett's gym in Newark, the first thing everyone noticed was his size. He was already much taller than the other kids. His arms were long, his hands were huge, and his feet looked like they belonged to someone much older. People saw his body and immediately expected greatness. But what they did not see was how lost he felt inside. Shaq had the size of a future superstar, but he did not yet have the skills. He was tall but awkward, strong but inexperienced, gifted but completely untrained. He moved like his body was still trying to catch up with itself. When he dribbled the basketball, his eyes followed the ball instead of the players around him. He would look down for 1 second, lose control, and suddenly the ball would roll away. When he tried to make simple passes, they often went in the wrong direction. When he tried to shoot, the ball sometimes missed the basket by a surprising distance. And when he played defense, his long arms moved faster than his understanding of the game. He would reach too early, step too late, and commit fouls without even realizing what he had done wrong. To anyone watching from the outside, Shaq looked like a kid with a lot of potential, but very little ability. Some people saw his size and thought he was supposed to already be great. When he was not, they laughed. The other kids in the gym were not trying to hurt him. They were young. They were joking around. They were playing the way kids play. But for a 14-year-old boy who was already struggling with confidence, even harmless laughter could feel heavy. Every mistake felt bigger than it really was. Every missed shot felt like proof that maybe he did not belong. Every time the ball slipped out of his hands, he felt like everyone noticed. And sometimes, that is the hardest part about being young. A small failure can feel like the end of the world. A bad practice can make you question whether you should even come back. But Coach Bennett was not watching the mistakes. At least, not the way everyone else was. The other kids saw a tall kid who could not play yet. Coach Bennett saw something different. He watched what Shaq did after he failed. That was what mattered to him. Because anyone can look good when everything goes right. Anyone can feel confident when people are cheering. But what happens when nobody is cheering? What happens when you miss? What happens when people laugh? That is when a person's true character appears. And every time Shaq made a mistake, Coach Bennett noticed the same thing. The boy never quit. He would lose the ball, then chase after it. He would miss a shot, then get back in line. He would make a mistake, take a breath, and try again. Shaq did not always know what he was doing on the court, but he knew one thing. He wanted to get better, and Coach Bennett saw that. One afternoon after practice, while the other kids were leaving the gym, Coach Bennett watched Shaq stay behind. The lights were already starting to dim. The sounds of sneakers and basketballs had disappeared, but Shaq was still there, still practicing, still missing, still trying. He picked up the ball after another failed attempt and prepared to shoot again. That was when Coach Bennett walked over. He did not talk about his height. He did not talk about his mistakes. He did not tell him that he needed to become someone else. Instead, he talked about something much more important. "Shake," Coach Bennett said. "Do you know what separates people who make it from people who don't?" Shaq looked at him, waiting for an answer. Coach Bennett picked up the basketball and slowly bounced it once. "It is not always talent." The young boy listened carefully. "Talent gets attention," Coach Bennett continued. "People notice talent. They talk about talent. They celebrate talent." He handed the ball back to Shaq. "But character decides who stays." Those words stayed with Shaq, because at that moment, Coach Bennett was teaching him something much bigger than basketball. He was teaching him that greatness was not built from being perfect. It was built from refusing to stop. A lot of people would notice Shaq one day because of his strength, his size, and his ability. But before anyone saw those things, Coach Bennett saw something more important. He saw a kid who was willing to keep showing up. A kid who was willing to be bad at something until he became good. A kid who could fall down and still find the courage to stand back up. Years later, when people asked Shaq what made him successful, many expected him to talk about his physical abilities, his height, his power, his basketball skills. But deep down, Shaq knew the truth. Those things helped him become a great player. But Coach Bennett helped him become the person who could keep going long enough to get there. Because before the world saw Shaq the superstar, Coach Bennett saw Shaq the kid, and he believed that kid was worth fighting for. Before Shaq became known around the world, before he played in front of thousands of fans inside huge arenas, there was a small gym in Newark that almost nobody outside the neighborhood knew existed. It was not a beautiful place. The walls were old. The lights above the court sometimes flickered. The basketballs had already been used for years and had lost their original shape. The wooden floor was covered with scratches from countless shoes running across it, and there were spots where the surface was uneven because the building had been worn down by time. The basketball hoops were not perfectly straight. The equipment was old. The building itself had many problems. But to the kids who walked through those doors, none of that mattered, because inside that forgotten gym, something special was happening. Dreams were being built. For many of those children, the gym was more than just a place to play basketball. It was a place where they could forget about the problems waiting outside. It was a place where they could be seen. A place where someone believed they had a future. And standing in the middle of it all was Coach Michael Bennett. He did not have a big salary. He did not have expensive equipment. He did not have the support of a major organization. What he had was time, patience, and a belief that every child who entered his gym was worth investing in. That was what made him different. Other people looked at young players and saw their current situation. Coach Bennett looked at who they could become. He saw potential before there was proof. He saw confidence before there was success. And he saw greatness before anyone else had a reason to believe it was there. For Shaq, that little gym became the first place where he felt like he belonged. At home, he was the kid who was different. At school, he was the tall kid everyone noticed. But inside Coach Bennett's gym, he was simply Shaq, a young player trying to improve, a kid who was allowed to make mistakes, a kid who was encouraged to keep going. Years later, Shaq would realize something important. The basketball lessons were only a small part of what Coach Bennett gave him. The real lessons happened when nobody was watching, because Coach Bennett was not only building basketball players, he was helping build people. What Shaq did not fully understand when he was younger was how much Coach Bennett sacrificed behind the scenes. The coach never talked about it. He never wanted attention. He never wanted the kids to feel like they owed him something. But over the years, Shaq slowly learned the truth about the man who had spent so much time helping others. There were children who came to practice with worn-out shoes because their families could not afford new ones. Coach Bennett noticed. He always noticed. Without making a big announcement, he would find a way to get them a new pair. Sometimes he would say a local sponsor donated them. Sometimes he would tell the kids the team had extra equipment. But the truth was much simpler. Coach Bennett paid for them himself. There were tournament fees that families could not cover. There were transportation problems that could have prevented kids from playing. There were moments when a child was about to quit because life outside the gym had become too difficult. And every time, Coach Bennett found a way to help. Not because he wanted praise, not because he wanted people to know what he had done. He helped because he understood something many people forget. A child cannot focus on chasing a dream when they are worried about things they cannot control. Sometimes a kid does not need a speech. Sometimes they just need someone to remove one obstacle standing in their way. Coach Bennett became that person for many children. One day, Shaq learned about some of these things and finally understood the kind of person his coach really was. He looked back at all those moments from his childhood and realized there was so much happening that he never noticed. The shoes, the meals, the support, the quiet sacrifices. He remembered seeing Coach Bennett arrive early and leave late. He remembered seeing his coach tired sometimes but never complaining. He remembered how Coach always seemed to find a solution whenever a kid had a problem. And Shaq finally understood. The gym was not held together by the walls. It was held together by one man's heart. Years later, Shaq asked Coach Bennett why he never told anyone about all the things he had done, why he never wanted credit, why he never wanted people to know how much he had sacrificed. Coach Bennett simply smiled. He looked at Shaq the same way he had looked at him when he was 14 years old, with patience, with kindness, with no need for recognition. "Why didn't you tell people you paid for everything?" Shaq asked. Coach Bennett thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because helping someone is not supposed to make them feel small." Those words stayed with Shaq, because that was the difference between Coach Bennett and many others. He did not help people in a way that made them feel like they were less. He helped them in a way that made them feel capable. He protected their pride. He protected their confidence. He made them feel like they were receiving an opportunity, not a favor. That lesson followed Shaq for the rest of his life. As he became more successful, he carried that same belief with him. When he helped others, he tried to do it quietly. When he gave back, he focused on dignity, not attention, because Coach Bennett had taught him something far more valuable than a basketball skill. He taught him that true greatness is not measured by how many people know your name. It is measured by how many lives become better because you were there. And inside that old, forgotten gym in Newark, a coach with worn-out basketballs and broken lights was creating something much greater than a basketball team. He was creating a future, and one of those futures belonged to a kid named Shaq. There are moments in life that seem small when they happen, but years later you realize they changed everything. For Shaq, one of those moments happened on a cold night in February 1987 inside a small gym in Newark. There were no cameras, no fans, no reporters. Nobody outside that building knew what was happening. But inside that old gym, a young boy was facing one of the hardest battles of his life. Not against another player, not against an opponent. He was fighting against the voice inside his own head, telling him that maybe he was not good enough. That night, Shaq was working on a new move that Coach Michael Bennett had been teaching him. It was a simple basketball move on paper. A strong player needed to learn how to control his body, use his feet correctly, and create space near the basket. But for Shaq, nothing about it felt simple. His body was growing faster than he could control. His feet were too big. His movements were still unbalanced. He understood what Coach Bennett was teaching him, but knowing something and being able to do it were two completely different things. He tried the move once. He failed. He tried again. Another mistake. He lost control of the ball. He stepped the wrong way. He moved too quickly. He moved too slowly. Every time he thought he was finally getting it right, something went wrong. The basketball bounced away. His feet slipped. His timing was off. And every mistake seemed to remind him of every other mistake he had made before. The gym was quiet except for the sound of the ball hitting the floor. Bounce, bounce, bounce. Shaq kept trying, but the frustration kept growing. He had spent weeks practicing this move. He had stayed after practice. He had worked harder than anyone else. But that night, nothing was working. He ran through the move again, then again, then again. Finally, his foot caught the wrong part of the floor, and he fell hard. The basketball rolled away into the shadows underneath the bleachers. Usually, Shaq would have jumped up immediately. Usually, he would have chased after it. Usually, he would have told himself to try again. But this time was different. He stayed on the floor. The cold wooden court pressed against his hands. His breathing became slower. The gym lights above him flickered slightly. For the first time, he did not feel like getting back up. At only 14 years old, Shaq experienced a feeling many people know very well. The feeling of working hard and still feeling like you are not improving. The feeling of trying your best and wondering if your best is enough. He looked around the empty gym. The same gym where he had spent so many hours practicing. The same place where Coach Bennett always told him he could become better. But that night, a different thought entered his mind. Maybe Coach was wrong. Maybe everyone was wrong. Maybe having a big body and big dreams did not mean he was actually meant to succeed. Maybe basketball was not for him. Maybe he was just a kid who was too tall, too awkward, and trying to become something he could never be. Shaq lowered his head. He did not cry, but he was close. Because sometimes the hardest moments are not when you fail in front of other people. They are when you fail alone and start questioning yourself. What Shaq did not know was that Coach Bennett was still there. He had not left. From his small office in the back of the gym, Coach had been watching. He saw every missed attempt, every mistake, every moment when Shaq wanted to give up. And he understood exactly what was happening. This was not a basketball problem. This was a life moment. Coach Bennett slowly walked across the gym. He did not come over angry. He did not tell Shaq to stop complaining. He did not give him a long speech about hard work. Instead, he did something Shaq never forgot. He sat down beside him, right there on the cold gym floor. Coach Bennett was not standing above him like someone giving instructions. He was sitting next to him like someone saying, "You do not have to face this alone." For a while, they said nothing. Two people sitting quietly in an empty gym, a young boy who was struggling, and a coach who believed in him. Finally, Coach Bennett picked up the basketball and looked at Shaq. His voice was calm. "Shaq, do you know what I see right now?" Shaq looked over. He expected Coach to talk about the mistakes. Instead, Coach said something completely different. "I see someone learning." Shaq stayed quiet. Coach Bennett continued. "You think you are failing because you cannot do it yet." He placed the basketball in Shaq's hands. "But you are not failing, Shaq." He looked directly at him. "You are becoming." Those words stayed with Shaq, because Coach Bennett was teaching him something that had nothing to do with basketball. Growth does not always look like success. Sometimes growth looks like missing. Sometimes growth looks like falling. Sometimes growth looks like sitting on the floor, wondering if you can continue. But the people who become great are not the ones who never struggle. They are the ones who keep going through the struggle. Coach Bennett stood up slowly and held out his hand. Then he said the words Shaq would carry for the rest of his life. Now get up." Shaq looked at him. "Try again." For a moment, the young boy stayed still. Then he reached for Coach Bennett's hand. He stood up. He walked back to the basket. He picked up the ball, and he tried again. The next attempt was not perfect. Neither was the one after that. But something had changed. The fear was gone. The doubt was quieter, because Shaq finally understood something. The goal was not to become great overnight. The goal was to keep becoming. That night in a cold gym in Newark, nobody saw what happened. There was no crowd cheering, no championship celebration, no headline the next morning. But that small moment became one of the most important moments of Shaq's life. Because before he learned how to dominate on the basketball court, he learned something even more important: how to stand back up when he wanted to stay down. And every time life knocked him down after that, every challenge, every failure, every difficult moment, he would remember that cold gym floor. He would remember Coach Bennett sitting beside him. And he would remember those words: "You are not failing, you are becoming." Sometimes the most important things in life do not look important when they first appear. Sometimes they are not trophies. They are not awards. They are not moments in front of thousands of people. Sometimes they are just small pieces of paper that someone almost throws away. For Shaq, one of the most meaningful memories of his life started with something simple: a piece of paper, a pencil, and a question from Coach Michael Bennett. It happened during one of those ordinary practices at the small Newark gym, the kind of day that nobody would have remembered if not for what happened afterward. The players had finished training, and Coach Bennett gathered everyone together. Instead of talking about basketball drills, shooting techniques, or defensive movements, he gave each player a blank piece of paper. The kids looked confused. They were expecting another basketball lesson, but Coach Bennett wanted to teach them something different. He wanted them to think about their future. "Before you become anything," Coach Bennett told them, "you have to believe that something is possible." He asked every player to write down what they wanted to become, not what other people expected them to become, not what their circumstances told them they could become, what they truly believed inside themselves. Some kids wrote about becoming professional athletes. Some wrote about becoming teachers. Some wrote about helping their families. Others struggled because they had never been asked that question before. For some of those children, the future felt too far away. But Coach Bennett wanted them to understand one thing: a dream does not have to start big. It only has to start with belief. When Shaq looked at the blank paper in front of him, he sat quietly for a moment. At that age, he was still trying to understand himself. He knew he was different. He knew people noticed his height. He knew people joked about his feet. He knew he was not yet the basketball player everyone expected him to become. But somewhere deep inside, there was still a small voice telling him that he could become something special. So Shaq picked up the pencil. He began drawing. It was not a perfect drawing. The lines were uneven. The body was just a simple figure. The smile was crooked. The arms and legs looked like they belonged to a child who was still learning how to draw. But there was one detail that stood out more than anything else: the feet. Shaq drew them bigger than everything else, almost too big for the rest of the body. And that made sense, because at that time, his feet were the thing everyone noticed first. They were the reason people laughed. They were the reason he felt different. But without realizing it, young Shaq turned the thing he was most embarrassed about into the biggest part of his dream. After finishing the drawing, he looked at the paper for a moment. Then he wrote a sentence underneath it. The handwriting was messy. The spelling was not perfect. The name was written the way only a 14-year-old boy would write it. But the meaning was clear. Shaq will become the greatest. It was not written by a confident superstar. It was written by a kid who was still learning how to believe in himself. That was what made it special. Because when Shaq wrote those words, he had no championship rings, no fame, no proof that he would succeed. Nobody outside that small gym knew his name. But he wrote it anyway. He believed it before anyone else did. After the other players finished, they started showing each other their papers. Some laughed, some joked, some were proud of what they wrote. Shaq looked at his own drawing and suddenly felt embarrassed. Maybe it looked childish. Maybe the dream seemed too big. Maybe other people would laugh at him. At 14 years old, confidence could disappear quickly. One small comment could make you question something you believed only moments before. So Shaq folded the paper. He pushed it away. And eventually he threw it into the trash. To him, it was just a silly drawing from a kid who did not know what the future would bring. But Coach Bennett saw something different. After the players left the gym, Coach stayed behind. He cleaned up the basketballs. He turned off the lights. And before he walked out, he noticed the paper sitting in the trash. Most people would have ignored it. Most people would have seen it as just another piece of garbage. But Coach Bennett stopped. He picked it up. He unfolded it carefully. He looked at the drawing, the big feet, the imperfect handwriting, the words written by a young boy who still had so much growing to do. And Coach Bennett smiled, because he understood something that Shaq did not understand yet. That piece of paper was not about a prediction. It was about belief. It was proof that somewhere inside this awkward, struggling kid was a dream bigger than his doubts. Coach Bennett carefully folded the paper and placed it somewhere safe. He did not save it, because he knew exactly what would happen. He did not know about championships. He did not know about fame. He did not know about the millions of people who would one day cheer Shaq's name. He saved it because he believed that every child deserves someone who protects their dreams when they are still too young to protect them themselves. Years later, Shaq would become one of the greatest basketball players in history. But before the world saw the champion, Coach Bennett saw the child. Before people celebrated the superstar, Coach Bennett believed in the dream. And that small piece of paper, thrown away by a young boy who did not yet understand his own greatness, became the one thing Coach Bennett refused to let disappear. Because sometimes a dream only needs one person to believe in it. And for Shaq, that person was Coach Michael Bennett. There are some goodbyes in life that feel ordinary when they happen. There is no dramatic music, no warning that tells you this moment will become one of the most important memories you will ever carry. Sometimes you simply walk away thinking you will see someone again soon, and you do not realize that you are leaving behind a chapter of your life that will never come back the same way. For Shaq, that moment came when his family had to leave Newark. At the time, he was still just a kid trying to understand himself. He was still learning basketball, still learning confidence, still trying to figure out where he belonged. He did not know that the small gym in Newark would one day become one of the most important places in his entire life. He did not know that Coach Michael Bennett would become more than just a basketball coach. He only knew that he was leaving the neighborhood where he had spent so many days, leaving the teammates who had become his friends, leaving the gym where he had made mistakes, learned lessons, and slowly started believing in himself. And most importantly, leaving the man who had seen something special in him before anyone else did. When Shaq first heard that his family was moving, his emotions were complicated. Part of him was excited. A new place meant a new beginning, a new environment, a chance to start over. But another part of him felt a sadness he could not fully explain, because even though he was young, he understood that something important was ending. The gym had become more than just a place where he practiced basketball. It was where he learned that mistakes were not something to be ashamed of. It was where he learned that failure was not the opposite of success. It was where he learned that someone could believe in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. And Coach Bennett had become the person who made all of that possible. But young Shaq did not fully understand the impact of those lessons yet. Children often do not realize the importance of the people who shape them until much later. At 14 years old, Shaq thought he was saying goodbye to a coach. He did not know he was saying goodbye to the person who changed the direction of his entire life. Before leaving Newark, Shaq went back to the gym one more time. The place looked exactly the same. The old basketballs were still in the corner. The wooden floor still carried the marks from years of practices. The lights still made the same quiet buzzing sound above them. It was familiar. It was home. Coach Bennett was there waiting for him. The two of them stood inside the gym, surrounded by the place where so many memories had been created. For a moment, neither of them said much. Sometimes the hardest emotions are the ones that are difficult to put into words. Shaq wanted to say, "Thank you." He wanted to tell Coach Bennett how much he appreciated everything. But at that age, he did not have the words. He was still just a kid. He did not yet understand how rare it was to find someone who believed in you before you had anything to prove. Coach Bennett looked at him and smiled. He knew this moment was bigger than basketball. He knew Shaq was about to begin a new chapter. But he also knew something else. The most important lessons Shaq had learned were not going to stay inside that gym. They were going with him. The coach placed a hand on Shaq's shoulder. He did not give him a long speech. He did not tell him to become famous. He did not tell him to chase trophies. Instead, he gave him the same kind of advice he had always given him. Simple, honest, something he could carry forever. "Don't promise me you'll come back," Coach Bennett said. Shaq looked at him quietly. The young boy probably expected something different. Maybe a goodbye. Maybe a reminder to keep practicing. But Coach Bennett continued, "Promise me you'll keep going." Those words stayed with Shaq, because Coach Bennett understood something that even Shaq did not understand yet. Life would take him to places far away from Newark. There would be challenges. There would be moments when he would doubt himself again. There would be times when the world expected more from him than he thought he could give. But if he kept going, he would find his way. That was the promise Coach Bennett wanted. Not a promise to return to the same gym. Not a promise to stay in the same place. A promise to never stop becoming better. Shaq nodded. At that moment, he did not know how powerful those words would become. He did not know that years later, when he faced pressure, criticism, injuries, and impossible expectations, those words would come back to him. Keep going. As Shaq walked away from the gym that day, he looked back one more time. Coach Bennett was standing at the door, watching, just like he had always done, watching a young boy take his first steps toward a future he could not yet imagine. Shaq left Newark that day believing he was leaving behind a coach, but the truth was different. He was carrying that coach with him. Every lesson, every word, every moment of belief. Because sometimes the people who change our lives do not stay beside us forever. Sometimes they simply give us enough strength to continue the journey without them. And that was exactly what Coach Michael Bennett had done. He had given a young boy something much greater than basketball skills. He had given him the courage to believe that he could become more. After leaving Newark, Shaq's life began moving faster than anyone could have imagined. The young boy who once struggled to control a basketball became a name known around the world. Years after leaving that small gym, Shaq continued to grow, both as a player and as a person. His talent became impossible to ignore. His size, strength, and ability on the court turned heads everywhere he went. The kid who once missed easy shots became one of the most dominant players basketball had ever seen. The world started watching. Fans filled arenas to see him play. Children wore his jersey. Newspapers wrote about him. Television cameras followed his every move. He became the superstar everyone knew. But while Shaq's life changed completely, one thing remained the same. Coach Michael Bennett stayed in Newark. He did not chase fame. He did not try to become part of Shaq's success story. He did not call reporters and say, "I was the one who helped him." He never looked for recognition. He simply continued doing what he had always done, helping kids who needed someone to believe in them. Because for Coach Bennett, his purpose was never about creating a famous basketball player. It was about helping young people believe they had a future, the same way he had done for Shaq. Years passed, and the world celebrated Shaq's accomplishments. People talked about his championships. They talked about his records. They talked about his incredible career. But far away from the spotlight, Coach Bennett was still walking into the same kind of gyms, still carrying basketballs, still talking with kids who doubted themselves, still showing up for people who needed him. The difference was that nobody was watching. There were no cameras, no interviews, no headlines, just a man quietly keeping his promise. Every afternoon, Coach Bennett would arrive early at the gym. Sometimes the building was cold. Sometimes the lights did not work properly. Sometimes there were only a few kids waiting for practice. But he showed up anyway, because he knew something many people forget. For some children, a coach is not just a coach. Sometimes that person is the only adult who tells them they matter. Sometimes that person is the only one who notices when something is wrong. Sometimes that person is the difference between a child giving up and a child continuing to try. Coach Bennett understood that because he had seen it with Shaq. He knew that a few encouraging words at the right moment could stay with someone for a lifetime. Outside the gym, Coach Bennett helped in ways most people never knew about. There were nights when a young player needed a ride home because their parents were working late. Coach Bennett would grab his keys and drive them home himself. There were families struggling to afford basic things. Coach Bennett would quietly find ways to help. There were kids who came to practice carrying problems much bigger than basketball, a difficult home life, a lack of confidence, a feeling that nobody believed in them. Coach Bennett would sit with them and listen. He did not always have perfect answers, but he was there, and sometimes being there was the answer. He never wanted children to feel invisible, because he remembered what it felt like for Shaq when people only saw what he could not do. The mistakes, the awkwardness, the things that made him different. Coach Bennett wanted every child to know that they were more than their struggles. Many people measure success by what they can collect: trophies, awards, money, recognition. But Coach Bennett measured success differently. He never stood on a championship stage. He never received a championship ring. He never had thousands of people chanting his name. But every time a former player came back and said, "Coach, you changed my life," that was his championship. Every time a kid who wanted to quit decided to keep going, that was his victory. Every time a young person believed in themselves because Coach Bennett believed first, that was his reward. Years later, Shaq would look back and realize something important. The world celebrated him because of what he achieved, but Coach Bennett mattered because of what he gave. One man became famous. The other remained almost unknown, but both created something powerful. Shaq built a legacy through basketball. Coach Bennett built a legacy through people. And in many ways, Coach Bennett's impact reached farther than any trophy could show. Because trophies sit on shelves, records eventually get broken, fame eventually fades, but the belief you give someone can stay with them forever. Coach Bennett never became a household name, but to every child whose life he touched, he was unforgettable. And somewhere in Newark, inside a small gym that most people had forgotten, the man who helped create a legend continued doing the same thing he had always done. He showed up. He believed. He helped kids discover that they were capable of becoming more. Because Coach Michael Bennett did not need a championship to prove he was great. The lives he changed were proof enough. When Shaq finally stepped inside Coach Michael Bennett's home, he expected to see old furniture, family pictures, and memories from a quiet life in Newark. What he did not expect was to see himself everywhere. At first, Shaq did not understand what he was looking at. The small living room was covered with pieces of a journey that had started decades earlier. Every wall told a story. There were old newspaper articles carefully placed inside frames. There were photographs from different moments of Shaq's career. There were magazine covers that showed him standing under bright lights, holding trophies, and celebrating victories in front of thousands of fans. There were pictures from his early basketball days, pictures from when he was still a teenager, pictures from when he was still learning how to believe in himself. But what surprised Shaq the most was not the number of memories on the walls. It was the fact that Coach Bennett had kept them all. for years, quietly, without telling anyone, without asking for recognition. Shaq slowly walked through the room, looking at every picture. Each one represented a different chapter of his life, a championship, an award, a major career moment. But standing there in Coach Bennett's home, Shaq realized something. This was not just a collection of achievements. This was a collection of memories, a collection of moments that one man had saved because he cared. Coach Bennett had not been following a superstar. He had been following a child he once coached, a child who struggled, a child who doubted himself, a child who needed someone to say, "Keep going." As Shaq continued looking around the room, he noticed something interesting. The biggest moments were not always the ones people expected. The championship pictures were there. But they were not the center of the room. They were not the things Coach Bennett seemed most proud of. Instead, Shaq noticed pictures that most people would probably overlook. A photo of him graduating, a newspaper article about his education, pictures of him helping children, images of him giving back to communities, moments that showed growth beyond basketball. That was when Shaq understood something about Coach Bennett. The coach was never impressed only by what he could do on the court. He cared about who he was becoming off the court, because Coach Bennett knew something many people forget. A person's value is not measured only by what they achieve. It is measured by the person they become along the way. For the world, Shaq's greatest moments were often connected to basketball, the championships, the records, the victories. But for Coach Bennett, the moments that mattered most were different. He was proud when Shaq became a better student. He was proud when Shaq used his success to help others. He was proud when Shaq showed kindness. He was proud when Shaq became someone younger people could look up to, because those were the things that proved his lessons had worked. Shaq stood quietly in the middle of the room, taking everything in. He had spent his entire career hearing people talk about what he had accomplished. They talked about his size, his talent, his dominance, his championships. But inside this small house in Newark, he saw a different version of himself. He saw the person behind the achievements, the person Coach Bennett had always cared about, not the superstar, the human being. Shaq looked at the walls again and shook his head. "Coach, you kept all of this?" Coach Bennett smiled softly. To him, it was not a big deal. They were just memories, just moments from a kid he believed in. But to Shaq, it meant everything, because this showed him something he had never fully understood. While the world was watching Shaq become famous, Coach Bennett was watching Shaq become a better person. That was the difference. Years later, people would ask Coach Bennett what he thought about Shaq's career. They wanted to know about the championships. They wanted to know about the records. They wanted to know about the superstar. But Coach Bennett always saw things differently. One day, someone asked him why he cared so much about every part of Shaq's journey, why he kept so many newspaper clippings, why he saved every picture, why he remembered every important moment. Coach Bennett smiled and gave an answer that explained everything. "Everyone counted his rings," he said. He paused for a moment. "I counted every time he became a better person." Those words revealed the kind of man Coach Bennett truly was. He was never chasing the spotlight. He was never trying to prove that he helped create a legend. He was simply proud of the person Shaq had become, because the greatest victory for a teacher is not seeing their student become successful. The greatest victory is seeing their student become someone who uses that success for good. As Shaq stood inside that room, surrounded by decades of memories, he finally understood the full impact of Coach Bennett's influence. The coach had not just helped him become a better basketball player, he had helped him become a better man. The lessons from that old Newark gym had followed him everywhere. Work hard, stay humble, help others, never forget where you came from. And most importantly, success means nothing if you cannot use it to make someone else's life better. The world knew Shaq as a champion. But inside Coach Bennett's home, Shaq saw something even more meaningful. He was not just a champion because he won games. He was a champion because someone taught him what truly mattered. And that lesson had started with one person believing in a young boy before the world knew his name. Time changes everyone. No matter how successful someone becomes, no matter how many memories they collect, life has a way of reminding people that nothing stays the same forever. For Coach Michael Bennett, the biggest change came after a stroke that affected the one thing he had always carried with him: his memories. The man who once remembered every child who walked into his gym began struggling to remember simple things. Names started disappearing. Dates became harder to recall. Small details from everyday life became confusing. Sometimes he would walk into a room and forget why he was there. Sometimes he would look at a familiar face and need a moment to understand who the person was. For someone who spent his entire life remembering others, it was painful when his own memories started slipping away. Coach Bennett had always been the person who remembered. He remembered which kids needed extra encouragement. He remembered who was struggling at home. He remembered the players who were too shy to speak. He remembered every small victory that nobody else noticed. But now, the man who kept so many memories for others was fighting to hold on to his own. There were good days and difficult days. On good days, Coach Bennett could sit in his favorite chair and talk about the past. He could remember old games. He could remember the gym. He could remember the kids who once filled that small basketball court with energy and dreams. But on difficult days, those memories felt far away, like pictures slowly fading in an old photo album. Sometimes Grace Miller would visit him and ask about people from the neighborhood. "Do you remember Marcus from the old team?" Coach Bennett would think for a moment. Sometimes he remembered. Sometimes he did not. "Do you remember the tournament we played in 1987? He would look down quietly, searching through his mind for something that was no longer easy to find. The hardest part was not forgetting information. The hardest part was feeling pieces of your own life, slowly moving further away. But even as many memories became harder to reach, there was one memory that refused to disappear. One story that remained clear. A young boy, a small gym in Newark, a basketball bouncing across an old wooden floor, and a kid who refused to quit. Coach Bennett might have forgotten certain names. He might have forgotten certain dates. He might have forgotten the details of many moments. But he never forgot the feeling of coaching Shaq. Some memories are not stored only in the mind. Some memories live deeper. They live in the heart. And for Coach Bennett, Shaq was one of those memories. He remembered the first time he saw that tall, awkward kid walk into the gym. He remembered how everyone noticed his size but ignored his struggle. He remembered the way Shaq moved, like his body was still learning how to control itself. He remembered the missed shots, the lost basketballs, the frustrated expressions. But most importantly, he remembered what happened afterward. He remembered the kid always coming back. That was the thing Coach Bennett never forgot. Not the statistics, not the achievements, not the fame, the effort, the determination, the heart. One afternoon, Grace found Coach Bennett sitting quietly in front of the old photographs on his wall. He was looking at pictures from Shaq's childhood. Not the championship pictures, not the famous moments, the old ones, the pictures from the beginning. Grace watched him carefully. "Michael, do you know who that is?" she asked, pointing at a picture of a young Shaq. Coach Bennett looked at the photo for a long moment. His face was calm. Then slowly a small smile appeared. "The kid with the big feet," he said. Grace smiled. "Yes." Coach Bennett continued looking at the picture. "He was always bigger than everyone else." He paused, but he never thought he was better than anyone. That was the memory that stayed. The boy behind the legend, the child behind the superstar. Years later, when Shaq heard about Coach Bennett's memory struggles, it affected him deeply, because Shaq understood something painful. The man who remembered his first steps was now losing pieces of his own journey. But even then, there was something beautiful about it, because while the world remembered Shaq because of what he accomplished, Coach Bennett remembered him because of who he was before he accomplished anything. He remembered the boy who needed encouragement, the boy who sat on the gym floor after a difficult practice, the boy who almost gave up but chose to stand back up, the boy with big feet and an even bigger dream. That was why, even after everything else began fading, Coach Bennett still knew Shaq. Maybe he did not remember every championship. Maybe he could not recall every team or every award. Maybe the details of the superstar's career became blurry. But somewhere deep inside, he still knew. The kid he believed in. The kid he encouraged. The kid whose dream he protected. Because some people leave memories behind, but some people become memories themselves. And for Coach Michael Bennett, Shaq was not just a player he coached. He was proof that one person's belief could change another person's entire life. The world saw a giant. The world saw a champion. But Coach Bennett always saw the same thing. A young boy standing in an old gym, holding a basketball, trying one more time. The boy with big feet. The boy who refused to quit. And no matter how much time passed, no matter how many memories faded away, that was the one story Coach Bennett's heart never forgot. When Shaq stepped further into Coach Michael Bennett's living room, he expected to see memories of an ordinary life. He expected old furniture, family photos, and small reminders of the years that had passed. He expected to see the home of an elderly man who had lived quietly in Newark. But after only a few steps inside, Shaq stopped. He froze. Because the room was not just a living room. It was a timeline. It was a story. It was almost 4 decades of one man quietly believing in another person. Every wall around him carried a piece of Shaq's journey. There were newspaper articles from different stages of his career. There were magazine covers showing him standing under bright lights. There were photographs from games that millions of people had watched. There were memories from moments that the world celebrated. But standing there, Shaq realized something that touched him even more deeply. Coach Bennett did not save those things because Shaq was famous. He saved them because Shaq was his kid. The boy he once coached. The child who walked into his gym with oversized shoes and no idea what his future would become. Shaq slowly walked around the room, looking at everything carefully. Each picture told a different story. There was the young player who was still learning. There was the teenager who was trying to understand his own strength. There was the athlete who eventually became one of the greatest basketball players in history. But mixed between those famous moments were things that surprised him. There were pictures of Shaq graduating. There were articles about his education. There were moments when he helped communities. There were stories about him giving back to children. There were memories that had nothing to do with basketball. And that was when Shaq understood what Coach Bennett had really been watching all these years. He was not just watching a basketball career. He was watching a person grow. While the world focused on points, championships, and awards, Coach Bennett was paying attention to something much deeper. He was watching the kid become a man. He was watching whether Shaq stayed humble, whether he remembered where he came from, whether he used his success to help others. Because to Coach Bennett, those were the moments that mattered most. For years, Shaq believed that the distance between him and Coach Bennett was because life simply moved on. People get busy. Years pass. Memories become harder to reach. He thought maybe the coach who helped him at the beginning had moved on to another chapter of his life. But standing inside that room, Shaq realized he had been wrong. Coach Bennett had never stopped caring. He had never stopped following his journey. He had never stopped believing in him, even when Shaq was thousands of miles away, even when the world knew him as a superstar. Coach Bennett was still the same person sitting quietly in Newark, watching from a distance, saving every article, keeping every picture, remembering every important moment. Not because he wanted credit, not because he wanted anyone to know what he had done, but because Shaq mattered to him. Shaq stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by memories he did not even know existed. For a moment, he became quiet. The emotions were too heavy to explain, because he had spent years thinking about coming back to thank Coach Bennett. He thought he was the one carrying the memories. He thought he was the one who remembered. But now he understood the truth. He was not the only one who held on to that connection. Someone else had been holding on to it too. Someone had been watching. Always. Coach Bennett had watched every step, every achievement, every challenge, every moment when the young boy from Newark became the man the world admired. And suddenly, Shaq saw something clearly. The greatest gift Coach Bennett gave him was not basketball. It was not a skill. It was not a technique. It was the feeling that someone believed in him before he had done anything to deserve it. That kind of belief stays with a person forever. Shaq looked at the walls again. 37 years of memories were standing right in front of him. 37 years of proof that he had never been forgotten. The world knew Shaq because of what he achieved, but Coach Bennett knew Shaq because of where he started, and that difference meant everything. The superstar who had faced thousands of people, played in the biggest arenas, and carried the expectations of millions, suddenly felt like the same young boy from Newark again. The kid who needed someone to say, "You can do this." And the amazing thing was that the person who said it first had never stopped believing. Not for one day, not for 1 year, not even after 37 years. At that moment, Shaq finally understood. He did not come back to remind Coach Bennett of his success. He came back to discover that the man who changed his life had been carrying his story all along. As Shaq continued looking around Coach Michael Bennett's living room, he thought he had already seen the most meaningful parts of the collection. The newspaper articles, the photographs, the memories from a legendary career. He thought those were the things that mattered most. But then his eyes stopped on something different, something small, something that looked completely out of place among all the achievements surrounding it. In the center of the wall, surrounded by championship moments and pictures of success, was an old piece of paper. Not a trophy, not a magazine cover, not a professional photograph. Just a simple piece of paper that had clearly been kept for many years. The edges were worn. The color had faded. The handwriting looked like it belonged to a child. Shaq slowly walked closer. At first, he did not understand why Coach Bennett had placed that paper there. Then he saw it. The drawing. And suddenly, everything came rushing back. It was the same drawing from the old Newark gym. The same piece of paper he had created when he was just 14 years old. The drawing was simple, a small figure, a crooked smile, a child's idea of what he wanted to become. But one thing stood out more than anything else: the feet. They were huge, almost too big for the rest of the drawing. The same thing everyone noticed about him back then. The same thing that made him feel different. The same thing that made other kids laugh. But when Shaq looked at that drawing now, he did not see something embarrassing anymore. He saw a child who had a dream. A child who was brave enough to write down what he wanted to become before he had any proof that it would happen. A child who believed in himself for a moment, even when he was still full of doubt. Shaq stood there quietly, staring at the paper. For a moment, the room disappeared. He was no longer standing inside Coach Bennett's home. He was back inside that old gym. He could hear the sound of basketballs hitting the floor. He could see the other kids laughing and showing each other their drawings. He could feel the embarrassment he felt that day. He remembered looking at his own paper and suddenly feeling like his dream was too big, too unrealistic, too childish. He remembered folding the paper. He remembered throwing it away. At the time, Shaq thought he was throwing away a bad drawing. He thought he was getting rid of something silly. He had no idea that he was almost throwing away a piece of himself. Coach Bennett watched Shaq from a short distance. He saw the expression on his face. He knew exactly what memory had returned, because he remembered that day too. Maybe he did not remember every date. Maybe some details from the past had become difficult to hold on to. But this moment had stayed with him, the moment when a young boy wrote down a dream and then became afraid of it. Shaq reached out slowly. His hand touched the edge of the paper. He was careful, almost like he was afraid the memory might disappear if he touched it too hard. His voice became quiet, almost a whisper. "I threw this away." The words carried more emotion than he expected, because he was not just talking about a piece of paper. He was talking about every moment when he doubted himself, every time he thought he was not good enough, every time he almost gave up. Coach Bennett looked at him and smiled gently. "I know." He paused. Then he said something that broke through all the years between them. "That's why I saved it." For a few seconds, Shaq could not say anything. Those simple words meant everything, because that was exactly who Coach Bennett had always been. When Shaq gave up on himself, Coach Bennett believed. When Shaq saw failure, Coach Bennett saw growth. When Shaq threw away his dream, Coach Bennett picked it back up, not because he knew Shaq would become famous, not because he knew the boy would one day become a basketball legend. He saved it because he believed that young boy deserved to have someone protect his dream, even when the boy himself was not ready to protect it. Shaq looked at the drawing again. The handwriting was imperfect. The picture was simple. The dream was written by a child. But inside that small piece of paper was something powerful. Hope, belief, possibility. It represented the moment before the world knew Shaq, before the championships, before the fame, before anyone called him a legend. It represented the beginning. And Coach Bennett had protected that beginning for almost 4 decades. Shaquille finally understood why this piece of paper was placed in the center of the wall. It was not there because it was the most impressive achievement. It was there because it was the first one, before the trophies, before the awards, before the millions of fans. There was this, a young boy with a pencil in his hand, imagining a future that seemed impossible, and one coach who looked at that dream and decided it was worth saving. That was the true story behind the wall. Not success, not fame, not greatness, belief. Because every great journey begins with a moment when someone chooses to believe before there is any reason to believe. And for Shaq, that person was Coach Michael Bennett, your name. But sitting there with Coach Bennett, Shaq saw success differently. Success was not only about reaching the top, it was about remembering the people who helped you climb there. It was about honoring the hands that lifted you when you were still learning how to stand. It was about understanding that no one becomes great alone. Shaq had spent his entire career being celebrated. Fans cheered for him. Media covered him. People admired what he accomplished. But Coach Bennett had given him something different. He had given him belief before there was anything to celebrate. And that kind of gift was priceless. As the hours passed, Shaq realized they had been sitting together for almost 4 hours. 4 hours of stories, 4 hours of laughter, 4 hours of remembering. It was longer than he originally planned, but somehow it felt like it was exactly the amount of time they both needed. Before leaving, Shaq looked at Coach Bennett. There were many things he wanted to say. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for seeing something in me. Thank you for never giving up on me." But somehow, simple words felt too small. So instead, he just sat there for another moment. Because sometimes being present says more than anything you can say. When Shaq finally stood up to leave, he carried something different with him. Not a trophy, not an award, not another achievement. He carried a reminder that the most important parts of life are not always the moments when the world is watching. Sometimes they are the quiet moments, the conversations nobody hears, the people who believe in you before anyone else does, the ones who help you become who you were meant to be. And as Shaq walked out of that small house in Newark, he understood the real meaning of success. The greatest achievement was never becoming famous. It was never being recognized by millions. The greatest achievement was remembering who helped you get there. And after all these years, Shaq finally had the chance to sit across from the man who started it all. After spending hours with Coach Michael Bennett, Shaq knew one thing for certain. Saying thank you was not enough. For years, Coach Bennett had given him things that money could never buy. He gave him confidence when he had doubts. He gave him patience when he struggled. He gave him belief when he had nothing to prove that he deserved it. And now, standing inside that small house in Newark, Shaq realized that this was his chance to give something back, not with a speech, not with a public announcement, not with cameras following him, just with action. Because that was exactly how Coach Bennett had always helped people, quietly, without asking anyone to notice. Before leaving the house that day, Shaq walked slowly through the rooms one more time. He wanted to remember everything, the walls filled with memories, the old photographs, the childhood drawing, the small details that showed how much Coach Bennett had cared. As Shaq walked toward the front door, something caught his attention. The porch. More specifically, one of the steps. The same broken step that Coach Bennett had carefully avoided when he first opened the door. It was a small problem, something most people would probably ignore. The crack was not dangerous enough to force immediate action. The porch still worked. The house was still standing. But Shaq noticed something. Every time Coach Bennett stepped outside, he moved slowly. He adjusted his balance. He carefully placed his foot in the right spot. It was something he had probably done for years, something he had accepted as normal. But Shaq saw it differently, because sometimes the people who spend their lives taking care of others forget to take care of themselves. And that thought stayed with him. On the drive away from Coach Bennett's house, Shaq was unusually quiet. Emily noticed. She knew something was on his mind. "Are you okay?" she asked. Shaq looked out the window at the streets of Newark, the same streets where his story began. "The man spent his whole life helping everybody else," he said. He paused. "But nobody was there to help him." That was the moment Shaq made a decision. He was going to help Coach Bennett, but he was going to do it the right way, the Coach Bennett way. No attention, no cameras, no interviews, no headlines saying Shaq saved his old coach. Because that was not what this was about. This was not charity. This was gratitude. Shaq quietly arranged everything. The broken porch step was repaired. The house received the care it needed. The old garden, which had slowly lost its beauty over the years, was restored. The home became safer and more comfortable. Most importantly, Coach Bennett would have the support he needed as life became more difficult. But Shaq made one request: keep his name out of it. No announcements, no publicity, no pictures. He did not want people talking about what he did. He only wanted Coach Bennett to feel cared for. Because that was the lesson he had learned from him decades earlier. Helping someone is not about making yourself look generous. It is about making another person feel valued. When Coach Bennett eventually noticed the changes around his home, he was confused. The porch was fixed. The garden looked alive again. The house felt different, better. He asked Linda Brooks, who had been helping care for him, what happened. "Who did this?" Linda smiled. She knew the answer, but she also knew Coach Bennett deserved to hear it in the right way. "It was Shaq." Coach Bennett looked surprised. Why would he do that? For a moment, Linda did not answer, because the reason was bigger than a repaired house. It was about everything that had happened between two people over nearly 40 years. Later, when Shaq heard that Coach Bennett asked why he helped him, he gave a simple answer: "Because you did it first." Those 5 words carried the entire story. Because Shaq was not just fixing a porch, he was returning a lesson. Years ago, Coach Bennett saw a young boy struggling and decided to help him. He did not ask for anything back. He did not know if that boy would become famous. He did not know if anyone would ever recognize his efforts. He helped because it was the right thing to do. Now, decades later, Shaq was doing the same thing. He was looking at someone who had given so much to others and saying, "You matter too." Coach Bennett spent his life teaching children that greatness was not about what you could take from the world. It was about what you could give. And Shaq finally understood the deepest lesson his coach had ever taught him. The greatest way to honor someone is not by telling the world what they did for you. It is by continuing the kindness they showed you. Coach Bennett once picked up a piece of paper from a trash can because he believed a young boy's dream was worth protecting. Years later, Shaq repaired a broken porch because he believed the man who protected that dream was worth protecting too. The roles had changed. The student had become the person giving back, but the lesson remained the same. Real greatness does not need an audience. The most meaningful acts are often the ones nobody sees. And somewhere in Newark, inside a small blue house that had quietly held decades of memories, Coach Michael Bennett finally received something he had given away his entire life: someone believing in him. After returning from Newark, Shaq carried something with him that was more powerful than any memory: a responsibility. For years, Coach Michael Bennett had given him something that could never be measured. He gave him confidence before success. He gave him support before recognition. He believed in him before the world had any reason to believe. And now Shaq understood that the best way to honor Coach Bennett was not by simply saying, "Thank you." It was by continuing what Coach Bennett had started. Because the greatest lessons are not meant to end with one person. They are meant to be passed forward. Not long after his visit with Coach Bennett, Shaq began building a new youth program inspired by the man who changed his life. He wanted to create a place where young people could receive the same kind of support he received when he was a kid. A place where children were not judged only by their current abilities. A place where mistakes were not treated as failures. A place where every child could hear the same message Coach Bennett once gave him: "You can become more." The Eagles Rise Foundation was built around that idea. It was not just about basketball. Basketball was the doorway. The real goal was helping young people grow into stronger, more confident individuals. The foundation provided basketball training for kids who wanted to improve their skills, but it also focused on education, because Shaq remembered that becoming successful required more than talent. Young athletes received guidance from mentors who could help them make better decisions. Families received support when they needed help. Children who felt overlooked finally had someone paying attention to them. Because Shaq knew what it felt like to be the kid everyone noticed for the wrong reasons. The kid who looked different. The kid who struggled. The kid who needed someone to see the person underneath the mistakes. When people asked Shaq why he invested so much time and energy into helping young people, he always thought about Coach Bennett. He thought about that old gym in Newark. He thought about the nights when Coach stayed late to help him practice. He thought about the moments when he wanted to quit, and Coach sat beside him instead of walking away. That was the kind of person Shaq wanted to become. Not someone who simply gave money, someone who gave belief. Because money can solve a problem for a moment, but belief can change the direction of a person's life. One afternoon, while visiting one of the foundation's youth basketball programs, Shaq noticed a young boy sitting alone on the side of the court. The other kids were practicing. They were laughing. They were competing. But this boy was quiet. He held the basketball in his hands but did not move. Shaq watched him for a moment. There was something familiar about him. The nervous look, the frustration, the feeling of being unsure if he belonged. Shaq had seen that look before, because he had once worn it himself. He walked over and sat down beside the boy, not standing above him, not giving him a speech, just sitting beside him, the same way Coach Bennett had done years earlier on that cold gym floor in Newark. The boy looked surprised. He did not expect someone like Shaq to sit next to him. "I can't do it," the boy quietly said. Shaq looked at him. "What makes you think that?" The boy looked down at the basketball. "Everybody else is better than me." For a moment, Shaq remembered being 14 years old, remembered the missed shots, the laughter, the doubt, the feeling that maybe basketball was not meant for him. And suddenly, he understood why this moment mattered. Because this was not just about a kid struggling with basketball. This was about a kid struggling to believe in himself. Shaq smiled and looked at the young boy. "You know something?" he said. The boy looked up. "I used to think the same thing." The boy seemed surprised. "You?" Shaq laughed softly. "Yes, me." He told the boy about the kid he used to be, the kid who could barely dribble, the kid who made mistakes, the kid who wanted to quit. "But someone believed in me before I believed in myself," Shaq said. He looked at the basketball in the boy's hands. "That's what you need right now." The boy listened carefully. "Not someone telling you that you're already perfect." Shaq smiled. "You need someone reminding you that you can get better." Then Shaq said the words that had been passed down to him decades earlier. The same message Coach Bennett gave him when he was sitting on that cold gym floor. "You are not finished." The boy looked at him. Shaq continued, "You are just beginning." Those words were simple, but they carried years of meaning, because they were not just words from a basketball player. They were words from a student who had once received the same lesson from a coach who refused to give up on him. In that moment, Shaq realized something beautiful. The circle had finally come complete. Years earlier, Coach Bennett sat beside a struggling kid and helped him believe. Now Shaq was sitting beside another struggling kid and doing the same thing. The student had become the teacher. The person who was once saved was now helping save others. And that was Coach Bennett's true legacy. Not a championship, not a trophy, not a record. A chain of people helping other people believe in themselves. Shaq became famous because of basketball, but his greatest impact came from something much bigger. He became the person who understood what it meant to need someone. And because Coach Bennett was there for him, Shaq made sure he would be there for others. Because one person's belief can travel further than they will ever know. A coach in a small Newark gym believed in a tall, awkward kid. That kid became a legend. And that legend made sure another young kid would hear the same message. Keep going. Believe. You are not finished. You are just beginning. Every morning, inside the small blue house in Newark, Coach Michael Bennett would sit quietly in front of the same wall. The world outside continued moving. Cars passed by. People walked through the neighborhood. Children went to school. Life continued changing around him. But inside that quiet room, Coach Bennett found peace in the memories he still had. And every morning, his eyes would return to the same thing. The old piece of paper. The same drawing. The same dream. The paper was worn after all those years. The edges were softer. The colors had faded. The handwriting was still that of a young boy who had no idea what the future would bring. But to Coach Bennett, it was more valuable than any championship trophy, because that paper represented the beginning. Before the world knew Shaq, before the cameras, before the championships, before millions of people celebrated his name, there was just a kid with a basketball and a dream. And there was one person who believed that dream was possible. Some memories had become harder for Coach Bennett to reach. There were names he struggled to remember. There were moments that became unclear. There were details that slowly disappeared with time. But whenever he looked at that drawing, something inside him became clear again. He remembered the boy. He remembered the gym. He remembered the effort. He remembered a young player who was not perfect, but refused to stop trying. That was what mattered most. Not the points, not the awards, not the fame, the heart, the determination, the courage to keep going when things were difficult. Because that was the part of Shaq that Coach Bennett always believed in. Years later, the world looked at Shaq and saw a legend. They saw the championships. They saw the records. They saw the superstar who dominated basketball courts around the world. They saw the man who became one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet. But Coach Bennett saw something different. He saw where it all started. He saw the young boy who once struggled to make a simple shot. He saw the kid who sat on the gym floor believing he might not be good enough. He saw the player who needed someone to say, "Try again." And that was the truth Shaq carried with him for the rest of his life. Before he became a legend, someone believed he could. Before the world celebrated him, one person encouraged him. Before anyone knew his name, Coach Michael Bennett knew his potential. The greatest part of Coach Bennett's story was not that he helped create a basketball superstar. It was that he taught Shaq something much bigger than basketball. He taught him that every person has potential. Sometimes people just need someone willing to see it before they see it themselves. That lesson became the foundation of everything Shaq did afterward. Every child he helped, every opportunity he created, every person he encouraged. It all came from that small gym in Newark. It all came from one coach who decided that a struggling kid was worth believing in. Years later, at one of Shaq's youth basketball programs, another small moment happened. A young player stood near the basket, holding the ball with nervous hands. He had been practicing the same shot over and over, but every attempt missed. The final shot bounced off the rim and rolled away. The boy looked down. His shoulders dropped. The disappointment on his face was familiar. Shaq recognized it immediately, because he had worn that same expression many years earlier. The boy looked like he wanted to walk away, like he was already deciding that maybe he was not good enough. But before he could leave, Shaq walked over. He picked up the basketball. He walked back to the young player. And instead of giving him a complicated lesson, instead of telling him everything he needed to fix, Shaq simply handed the ball back, just like Coach Bennett had done for him. The boy looked up. Shaq smiled. Again. The boy held the basketball. He looked uncertain. Shaq nodded. Try again. That one moment carried a story that had started decades earlier. A coach once encouraged a young boy. That boy became a man. That man became a legend. And that legend passed the same belief forward. Because greatness is not only about what you achieve, it is about what you inspire others to believe they can achieve. Inside the small blue house in Newark, Coach Bennett still sat beside the wall, still looking at the old drawing, still remembering the dream. Maybe he did not know every detail of Shaq's career anymore. Maybe some memories had faded. But the most important one remained. A kid with big feet. A kid with a big dream. A kid who needed someone to believe. And Coach Bennett was there. That was his legacy. Not because he created a champion, but because he helped create belief. And sometimes, one person's belief is all it takes to change a life. Because before there was a legend named Shaq, there was a coach who looked at a young boy and simply said, "Keep going.